Sisters, do you have one?
Yes.
A handout?
Yes.
Okay.
I kind of went through, and wherever I saw a Bible, I put one down,
Thank you.
so. We'll go ahead and get started. Depending upon how this first part of the class goes, we may want to have Bibles ready to go during the second half of the session today. But I want to begin, and if you'll, there's two sides to this, and we want to look at the side that says scientific method. And the scientific method searches for answers to the question, how does God's creation work? And anybody who has a high school diploma probably got this, but if you're like me, that's back in the days of arrows and spears of woolly mammoths.
Yeah.
So you might not remember it, so I thought we'd review the scientific method and talk about it a little bit. Last week we talked a little bit about the transition from the philosophy called scholasticism to the philosophy called Christian humanism. And the big point, and there are tons of differences between the two philosophies, but the one difference that I wanted to call your attention to was the idea that Christian humanism had the idea we've got to go back to first sources when we're looking for truth. So scholasticism, they were fine with Jerome's Vulgate. But when Luther sort of converted from scholasticism to humanism, and then he translated the Bible into German, he says, I got to get a hold of the original Greek and original Hebrew as close as I can get it. And so he did his translation from the original Greek and Hebrew. And he was also, let's go back to God's Word and not be looking at all these councils and popes and everything that contradicted themselves. And as we look at the scientific method today, you're going to find out there's one step in here that owes a great debt to Christian humanism. Now, there are probably a dozen different ways you can write the scientific method. And I put two of them on the paper here, and you can just kind of keep these for references as we talk. But the way I would say it is that you begin, you notice a pattern. So, a pattern, what do I mean by a pattern? Well, if your last name is Boyle, B-O-Y-L, you say, okay, I have a volume of gas. If I heat it up, the pressure increases. If I cool it down, the pressure decreases. Okay? If I take that volume of gas and I squeeze it and make the volume smaller, the pressure goes up and the temperature goes up. And you notice this pattern. Okay? So that's the beginning of his inquiry into that. And then the next thing you do is you observe. And by observing, I mean, that means taking careful measurements. This is, a lot of times it's done in the laboratory if possible, or if it's something that can't be done in a laboratory, they do things to make the what they're measuring legitimate. So to give you an example of how that might work, when I had surgery to take my cancerous kidney out, I was eligible for a drug trial. And what do they do in a drug trial? They do what they call a double-blind study. See, they can't just measure, they can't just give this drug to people and see how it works. They have to give a drug to half the people, and then they give a placebo to the other half. And basically what that does then is you have two populations, and the only difference between the two populations is one's getting a placebo and the other one's getting a real thing. And by that, what they've done is they've narrowed the situation down so they're only testing for one variable. And so that's what we mean when we say we observe the situation. Okay? In physics, it's a lot easier. You take it in the laboratory, and every day you put the temperature at 20 degrees centigrade, which is 68 degrees Fahrenheit. And you do that every day, and then you can vary the pressure, you can vary the volume, you can do all kinds of things with it. My dad had a wonderful experiment that he ran in the classroom. He had this big bell jar, and he would put a beaker full of water in a bell jar, and he'd sit the bell jar down on this platform that had a little grease, forming an airtight seal. And then he started pumping air out of the bell jar. When we got enough air out of the bell jar, the water started boiling. Because one of the things that determines, and this is why if you look on a cooking package, it has a high altitude directions. It's because at high altitude, the pressure is less and the boiling point is different. And so you gotta have different directions. And so he boiled water at room temperature because he just pulled all the air out of the bell, the bell tube. And that was an observation that we could make. So you observe. So once you've done enough observations, then you form, and this is one of the big steps, you form a hypothesis. Now every time you see the scientific method written down, they should use the word hypothesis, because that's a big important word. Now hypothesis is basically you have, through observation, observed the pattern, and you have written down a description of how that pattern works. And a lot of times that description is written in mathematical symbols that scare us all half to death. Unless you like math and like me, It's like, oh, that's cool. So we have the hypothesis. Now here is where humanism comes into the fray. Here's the contribution that humanism makes. Then you do an experiment. And this is a very important part of the scientific method, because the experiment is the judge. If the experiment fails, your hypothesis is wrong. If your experiment is a success, then your hypothesis is correct, it's valuable, it's good, it's valid. And that's what we're looking for. We're looking for a valid hypothesis. Now sometimes, if the experiment fails, you can learn from that and you say, oh, I need to fix the hypothesis. You make changes to the hypothesis to take into account how the experiment went. And the experiment becomes part of the observation process. So sometimes you go through this over and over and over again, and you see both of these, they say, hey, you go back to step and do it again until you get it right. Okay, once you're happy with the way the experiment came out, then what do? You publish. And what's the result of the publishing? Everyone who's interested in your description of how God's creation works, they do experiments, they test. Now here's the thing. When you design this experiment, you do everything you can in this experiment to try to make your hypothesis fail. And if you can't do it, then you publish it. And what does the rest of the world do? They test your hypothesis. And how do they test your hypothesis? Let's see if we can mess this up. Let's see if we can make this fail. And if after you publish and after you test, and the whole world has a go at it, and they can't make it fail, then they take this hypothesis and they call it a law. And I have come to the point where I don't really like it that they do that, but that's what they do. Okay, so we have like the second law of thermodynamics, you know, or Newton's law of action and reaction and that sort of thing. And we call them laws, and the reason that I don't like the word law is we think that something works that way because this law says it has to. And that's not really right. It works that way because that's the way God created it to work. And what this law really does is it describes how that work works. Okay, now, let's talk a little bit about the vocabulary that we hear in modern day. Do you see anywhere in this scientific method that allows for something called a consensus? Okay,
Maybe the test.
what's that?
You might see it in test. When you publish it and there's testing, there could be a consensus that, yeah, this is actually
Well,
fact.
but the consensus, is the consensus based on what the scientists think or on how the test turned
How
out?
the test turns out.
Yeah.
Yeah. So if the test is successful, then that's a scientific fact. That's how God's creation works. So as soon as I hear somebody say the scientific consensus is, a little red alert light goes off in the back of my head and I say, okay, this person doesn't really know what they're talking about. Okay, have you ever heard of this scientific consensus?
The published ones. There's
One woman who shall remain nameless, but she used to be Speaker of the House. And every time she said the word science, I'm like, she said it the way you're like, I think she just learned that word in her vocabulary for the day and she doesn't really know what's going on. We're following the science. Oh, you know. So scientific consensus. I'll give you an example from my own experience. In my almost 3 decades of engineering, all of the work that I did was what's called prototype work. That is, all the controls that I designed for machinery were one of a kind. We built, all the companies I ever worked for built custom, well, except for the one when I worked for Montgomery. I worked for Montgomery Elevator a little while, and that was something we wanted to make the same in every elevator, but other than that. So, I receive the machinery specs from the mechanical engineers, and then I design a control system to make the machine work. Well, what did I do? Then I handed off my design to another engineer to check it, because I'm only human and I'm going to make mistakes. And the other engineers, they give their designs to me to check for them, because the idea is you get more than one eye on it. And eventually we had an engineering consensus that this machine was going to work. In my almost 3 decades of engineering experience, when I got out into the field and actually had the real machine there and had to make it work, one time did I push the little green button and the machine actually came to life and worked the way it was supposed to. One time! The rest of the time, there was always something wrong, even though we had an engineering consensus that it should work. And so that was one of the things, and I spent, depending upon how big the system was, a week to a couple months getting all the equipment up and running and tuned and so forth so that it would work properly. And the machine in this case was the experiment. It actually turned the machine on and tried to make it run, and it didn't. And so then we had to go back and redo the hypothesis until the machine ran. The hypothesis being the design that I'd set up for the machine. So this is a very important part of the scientific method. Okay? You've got to be able to do an experiment or testing. Okay? Now, let's talk about the theory of evolution. Let's set aside the fact that the theory of evolution is a myth. Okay, let's just set that aside. Let's just, for the sake of argument, assume for the time being it's true. How do you test it? Can you bring the theory of evolution into a laboratory and run a test on it and make it work again? Can you do an experiment on it? Okay? Or ask you something more recently. How many of you believe that John Wilkes Booth assassinated Abraham Lincoln? Yeah, that's pretty much an accepted truth. Can I prove that scientifically? Okay, can I run an experiment? Can I get in my lab and make a theater chair and put an Abraham Lincoln in it and then create a John Wilkes Booth and run the experiment again? Everybody go, no. You can't do that. Why? Because now we're not dealing with the scientific truth. Now we're not trying to answer the question, how does God's creation work? Okay. What is the question we're asking when we're dealing with historical facts?
History.
We're dealing with history, it's like, what happened? Okay? And there is something out there called a historical method. Now, I get into the historical method with you, but then I'd have to give you college credit and it would take another year. Because a historical method is huge. Okay? The historical method is what we deal with in a court of law. And in reality, the theory of evolution, even if it were true, which it isn't, but even if it were true, does not belong in science. It belongs in history. Now, why are they trying to put it in science? And here we get into propaganda. During the time when Darwin was putting together the theory of evolution, science was doing all kinds of wonderful things. You know, labor-saving devices were getting invented faster than, faster than, I don't know, grease, lightning, whatever your metaphor is for fast. I mean, we're coming up with all kinds of machinery. Suddenly we had ships that could sail the ocean, compasses. A guy over in England came up with a clock that would actually work on a ship. That's actually technically rough because, on land where you're not moving and you got a nice pendulum, but as soon as you put that pendulum on a ship and the ship's a pendulum all by itself, that makes it kind of rough. So you had to come up with a whole different way of making an accurate timepiece that would allow people to make it safer to navigate the ocean. All these labor-saving devices are coming into being. Steam engines, all this kind of stuff. And so people are saying, look at all the wonderful things that science is doing. Science is gaining this reputation of being a solution for all kinds of problems. In medicine, vaccines were starting to come. I don't remember exactly when, probably, what was that, about the time of the Korean War when they found penicillin? Or was it earlier than
World
that?
War II,
Earlier,
in the late 30s.
yeah. Talk about an observation. He saw a pattern. Here's this mold and there's no bacteria growing around it. I wonder why that is, you know? And eventually they discovered penicillin. But the thing is, science had this reputation of providing solutions. And so whether Darwin did this on purpose, or whether he was just influenced by the evil one, he decided, let's make evolution part of science. And here's a really interesting thing. What happens when somebody publishes something in evolution and the world goes around to try and prove it's false? Yeah. Okay. Suddenly, no, that's not allowed. You're not getting your next fellowship financed. Right? Basically, pressure is put on the people to accept the published work and not really give it a vigorous test. And that goes against everything that science stands for. See what they're doing there? So, I think we have time to get into our Bibles. And what I would like us to do is, and if you don't have one, I'm just going to read it real quick. If we would turn to Matthew chapter 4. And if we look at verse 1 of Matthew chapter 4, this is the beginning of the temptation of Jesus. And as I read through it, I want you people to be thinking of the question, what is the weapon that these two combatants used as we were having the temptation? What is the weapon? Okay. We began in Matthew chapter 4, verse 1. By the way, this is repeated in Luke if you feel like looking at that. Okay, Matthew 4, verse 1. Then Jesus was led up by the Spirit into the wilderness to be tempted by the devil. Just a quick detail there. We should understand Jesus is almost still wet from his baptism. I mean, this follows directly. One of my profs at college is like, when John baptized Jesus, like he painted this great big old bullseye on the back of Jesus and dared the devil to shoot at him. This guy said, "This is my beloved son," and the devil's like, "Oh, yeah." Let's work with that. Okay. And after fasting 40 days and 40 nights, he was hungry. Anybody want to say that Jesus is a human being? He was hungry. I'm thinking after 40 days and 40 nights, I'd be hungry too. Be kind of cranky.
2 nights,
Yeah.
maybe.
And the tempter came and said to him, "If you are the Son of God." Notice, if you're the Son of God, I mean, we just had the baptism thing where God said you're his son, but are you really? Why would God bring you out here to starve for 40 days and 40 nights? But if you are the Son of God, command these stones become loaves of bread. Easy peasy for the Son of God, right? Double dog dare you. No.
Yeah.
But he answered, "It is written, man shall not live by bread alone, but by every word that comes from the mouth of God." Okay, what's the weapon that the two combatants used? Word of God. Well, not the devil so much.
No.
Words. Okay. Then the devil took him to the holy city and put him on the pinnacle of the temple and said to him, "If you are the Son of God, throw yourself down, for it is written." And the devil can quote scripture. He will command his angels concerning you, and on their hands they will bear you up, lest you strike your foot against a stone. Now, if you go back and you read the original scripture, the devil kind of conveniently left a few words out. He does that. Misquote scripture. Jesus said to him again, it is written, you shall not put the Lord your God to the test. Again the devil took him to a very high mountain and showed him all the kingdoms of the world and their glory. And he said to him, all these I will give you if you will fall down and worship me. Then Jesus said to him, begone, Satan, for it is written, you shall worship the Lord your God, and him only shall you serve. Then the devil left him, and behold, angels came and were ministering to him. Okay, now that ends the account in Matthew. Luke adds one little thing, which is kind of important. It says, the devil left him for a more opportune time. Since this is not the end of Jesus' temptations, and you can make the case that every time Jesus went up in the mountain to pray, it was usually after a temptation. Like feeding the 5,000, they want him to make him king. And Jesus is like, oh, this is no good. And he hustles the disciples in the boat, get on the other side, and then he runs up into the mountain to pray. Because it was a temptation to him. Because he could set up a healing ministry right there in the desert, and nobody would bother him. So the temptations didn't end here. But the point I want to make for today, what do we have? We have a war of words. The devil's taking words against Jesus, and then does Jesus fight back and say, oh, that's misinformation, you can't do that? No, Jesus fights back by quoting the Word of God. A lot of times from Deuteronomy of all places. That always surprises me. I'm like, of all the books of Moses to quote from, Deuteronomy is kind of the most obscure, you know? And so, but Jesus quoted from it. So we have a battle of words. Now, does Satan still use that today? How many times do you hear a politician give a speech and they use a certain set of words and they put what? Spin on it, right? Because what are they doing? They want, when they say these words, they want you to think this way, rather than the way you would normally speak. Okay. One of the examples that comes to me, a certain politician who occupies the office of President of the United States, when he first came out, he says, we're going to get people back to school full time. And what are the parents thinking? Okay, 9 to maybe 2:30, 3 o'clock, 5 days a week except for holidays, right? So Biden gets the kids to go back 1 day a week, and he said, well, that's what I meant when I said full-time back to school. And everybody says, well, that's not how he took it. See, they're always messing with the words. Always messing with the words. Always changing the words to mean something that they don't mean. Or that they haven't meant historically. Okay? I think when we talked about Arabic numerals, I'm thinking, okay, the zero placeholder, the concept, they came up with that in India. Most people are kind of brown-skinned. And then the Arabic numerals that we use are, well, they're Arabic numerals because they came in Arabia. Most people are kind of brown-skinned. And then we hear somebody in the educational realm saying, teaching kids that 2 + 2 = 4 is racist. You know? Mathematics is mostly invented by people with pretty dark-colored skin. The Greeks are probably the lightest color there is in the whole group. But we have the Egyptians, we have the Arabians, we have the Eastern Indians. Our culture today is trying to change words to get things past you, to con you. And that's a trick that the forces of evil have used. Genesis chapter 3. Did God actually say? This is a battle of words. Unless we think words aren't dangerous, one of the greatest orators of all time was Adolf Hitler. He had the people of Germany in his hand because he could speak. He could talk. He got them all riled up. And he had thousands of people, see Kyle, see Kyle. So one of the things we have to be careful of is words. So, turn your handout over. I want to talk a little bit about the historical method. The historical method is the method that we use in our courtrooms. Okay? And what do you hear? We have to prove that someone is guilty beyond a reasonable doubt. And that is another way of seeking for truth. The only thing the truth we're looking for is the answer to the question, what happened? So when we're looking at something like the theory of evolution, we should be using the historical method. Okay, have you shown this beyond a reasonable doubt? And what do we always have in a courtroom? We've got the prosecution and the defense, right? Two different sides. When we have evolution in our society, is there a defense? Is there a defense that says, wait, you guys are doing evolution, it's not right? We have plenty of scientists who want to say that. But what happens if they actually come out in public and say that, then their fellowship grant does not get granted. And so in order to get the money for the grant, they have to shut up and toe the party line. It was very interesting when our daughter was at Iowa State getting her degree in microbiology. She earned a little money on the side by working at one of the labs in the university. In this laboratory, they work with fruit flies. And she said, I can't believe, because these guys were manipulating the DNA of the fruit flies for scientific study. And she said, I can't believe these guys. You got this one guy, he manipulated the DNA, and we ended up with a fly that instead of having antenna coming out of his head, he had legs coming out of his head. You know, stuff like that. But she was in charge of cleaning up the equipment. She was in charge of breeding fruit flies and put them under some kind of magnification, like, okay, you're a male fruit fly, you're a female fruit fly. And she had to go through the female fruit flies like, you're pregnant, you're not, you know, so that she could guarantee that when the scientist was working with that, they had males and females, and they knew that they hadn't already mated and that they could perform whatever experiment they wanted to do. So she said, when they came in, they all believed the theory of evolution. And after they worked with the DNA and how complicated the DNA is, he says, by the time they got their doctorates, most of them thought the theory of evolution was a bunch of bunk. Now, they didn't say that publicly or out loud, but when they're around the coffee machine or at the cafeteria or something, they say, no, what are we going to do? Because this is, you know, this is no good. It doesn't work. It doesn't explain what I'm finding in the experiments that I'm doing. So, have that. Okay, historical method. I wanted to share with you something that we know about the manuscripts of the Bible, and I have a table down there for you. When a historian is judging a manuscript for its veracity, you know, is Is it true? How much can we trust it? How close is it to the original and that sort of thing? There are a couple of things they do. One, how many manuscripts are there? Okay, the more manuscripts there are, the more likely it is we have the true words. The second thing they go with is how close in time are the manuscripts that we have, which are all copies, to the original when it was written. The closer, the better. Okay? Now, if you look at the table, and if you go down to the bottom, the second line from the bottom, Homer's Iliad. It was written about 900 BC. The earliest fragment that we have of that document is from 400 BC. Okay? That's a 500-year gap. Okay? And we have 643 manuscripts. Now that puts Homer's Iliad firmly in number 2. And if you look at some of the others, single digits, like the writings of Suetonius, there are 8 manuscripts, and it's 800 years. The manuscripts we have are 800 years from the originals. Tacitus is considered the father of modern history. We have 20 manuscripts, and the earliest manuscript is 1,000 years from the original. Now drop down and look at the Bible. It's nuts, isn't it? All these others, the number one, Homer's got 643. The number of manuscripts we have of the Bible numbers 24,000. And the earliest manuscripts we have are somewhere between 25 and 50 years from the original. So all the others are like in hundreds and thousands of years. It means the pedigree of the Greek New Testament, now we're not talking Old Testament here, but the pedigree of the Greek New Testament writings is about 1,000 times more certain than any other writing of humanity. And if you go to a Department of History, they're like, oh my goodness. They'd be like, this is luxury. They'd be doing a dance of joy to have this kind of evidence. Now, the reason that plays in is the more manuscripts we have, the more comparisons they do, the more certain we can be that we have the original text. And with this kind of thing, it's like 99.99, percent certain that we have the original Greek of the New Testament. There are a couple of texts like the ending in Mark and the story of the woman caught in adultery. It's like, and the only problem with the woman caught in adultery is it appears in different places in different manuscripts. And sometimes you'll be reading along and you'll go from verse 12 to verse 14 or verse 21 to verse 23 or something. We'll skip a verse, and then down in the footnotes is the verse. That's because they did some looking at like, that verse might be part of the Bible, but maybe it isn't. So these are all things that treat to the veracity of the Bible's the New Testament. And then the New Testament in turn verifies the Old Testament, because Jesus is quoted in the reading I just did, Deuteronomy. So all of a sudden you say, well, we're pretty sure Jesus actually said that. And if Jesus thinks Deuteronomy is good, then we may be better too. And so Jesus and Paul and Peter and all the writings in the Greek New Testament quote so much of the Old Testament that that kind of leapfrogs and verifies the Old Testament for us, so that we can be confident that we have the Old Testament. Plus, they had some error checking routines that just blow your mind, which we might talk about at a later time, because we're getting kind of close to when I have to stop. But I just wanted to get, now the historical method, because there's a lot of other things. Just give you one more example. Go to the history of the Syrians, let's say, and they find a historical account of a battle. And they said, we engaged the enemy in the battle, and the first day we encountered some outlying scouts and troops, and we pounded them into the dirt. And the next day, we spent the whole day and we totally decimated them. And then the third day, we had some mopping up operations and we conquered them. Okay? Then they find another account, and they said there was a battle on this day, and they came against us, and they just came against a few scouts, and the scouts drove them away. But they kept coming, and eventually we did battle for 10 days, and eventually there were just too many of them, and you're like, there's radically different accounts of the battle. But the historian says they both agree there was a battle. So we can know there was a battle. Now, how the battle went and that kind of thing, we're going to have to do more research, but we know there was a battle. And so the historian can write down with certainty, there was a battle. And it took place in this place, because both sides agreed, here's where the battle took place, around this town or in this field or something. And that's kind of how the historical method goes. Because the tricky thing is, all the eyewitnesses have long since gone to meet their maker. And so you just have to look at written accounts, artifacts, writing carved in stone, that sort of thing. So we'll talk about that a little bit next time, and we'll talk a little bit more about evolution next time, but I kind of wanted to whet your appetite for this. So any questions before I take the ball and chain off your ankles? Yes, ma'am.
I might have missed it, but have you talked about the missing link?
You know, the missing link is a funny thing. Think about that. Think about those words. It's missing.
Yeah.
You know, everybody talks about the missing link like it's a real thing, but the word missing is in the name. It's missing. The technical term, but they call it transitional form. Where are the transitional forms from this instance to that instance? And we can talk about that a little bit later on. But yeah, the missing link is missing. You know. So, and yet, when you hear somebody talk about it, they use their words, and they make it sound like the missing link is a real thing, you know, when they haven't found any.
And there's been attempts to say, oh, this is from this insurance, and it turns out there's a bone, that big,
Yeah,
and it turns out to be a pig bone.
okay. I'm gonna say one more thing, and then we really gotta close. I have never seen a branch of science that has so many hoaxes attached to it. Why are there so many hoaxes? It's because they're not allowed to do this part. They publish, and then everybody wants to run a test, but the guy says, my fossil! You know, and won't let anybody else look at it. Well, how are you gonna publish and run a test if the guy won't let the world have access to the fossil record, or whatever it is? But there was one, he found a human skull, and there was another bone nearby, and they're like, oh, look, it's bottom jawbone. They put the jawbone on, and like, oh, look, that doesn't look at all like a human being. This must be one of those transitional forms. And then later on, some guy figured out how to process the human genome, and so they took the lower jawbone off, like, this is a jawbone from a pig, you know? The top part is a human skull. This is a jaw, bottom jaws from a pig. And so no wonder it doesn't look like a human being. You know, it may be that the guys were, you know, some catastrophe hit them while they were having a pork dinner, and there were pig bones and human bones mixed together, and who knows? But there's been so many hoaxes, and many of the things that are still in our schools' science books about evolution have long ago been proved to be hoaxes and invalid for this scientific process. So now, why don't we close with the word of prayer?